Hey there, welcome back to Story Slices, where we slice through the best Reddit tales just for you. Let's dive right into the first story. The first one is the Tittle story, and it starts like this. I never thought buying my first home would lead to a neighborhood war, but here I am, staring at a freshly erected fence on what's supposed to be my property. Let me back up a bit and explain how I ended up in this mess. My name's Mike, and I'm a 32-year-old software developer. After years of saving and living in a cramped apartment, I finally had enough for a down payment on a modest house in a quiet suburb. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had a decent-sized yard and enough room for me to set up a home office. I was ecstatic when my offer was accepted, and I closed on the house about a month ago. The first couple of weeks were a whirlwind of moving, unpacking, and settling in. I was so caught up in making the inside of the house feel like home that I barely paid attention to the yard. That changed when I decided to start planting a small vegetable garden in the back. I went out early on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, to survey the land and figure out the best spot for my future tomatoes and peppers. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a line of wooden stakes with bright orange ribbons tied to them, cutting across what I thought was my backyard. Confused, I walked over to inspect them. They formed a neat line from one side of the yard to the other, about 10 feet in from where I thought my property line was. I stood there, scratching my head, when I heard a voice behind me. "About time you noticed." I turned to see a woman standing at the fence separating our properties. She looked to be in her late 50s, with graying hair cut into a bob, and a pinched expression that made it seem like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "I'm sorry?" I said, still not understanding what was going on. She sighed dramatically. "The property line? I've had my surveyor out here twice now to mark it correctly. You've been encroaching on my land." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "I'm sorry, but I think there must be some mistake. I just bought this house, and according to my deed, my property extends another 10 feet or so." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Well, your deed is wrong. I've lived here for 25 years, young man, and I know exactly where my property ends. I've been meaning to put up a fence for years, and now that I finally have the money, I'm not going to let some newcomer stop me from using my own land." I felt my temper rising but tried to keep my voice calm. "Look, Mrs. Henderson," she supplied, her tone icy. "Mrs. Henderson," I continued, "I understand you've been here a long time, but I have legal documents showing where my property line is. Maybe we could compare our deeds and sort this out?" She scoffed. "There's nothing to sort out. I'm putting up my fence next week and that's final." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back into her house, leaving me standing there, dumbfounded. I spent the rest of the weekend poring over my property documents and researching property laws online. Everything I found confirmed that the land Mrs. Henderson was claiming was, in fact, mine. I even found the original survey from when the neighborhood was first developed, clearly showing the property lines. On Monday morning, I called the real estate agent who had helped me buy the house. She was sympathetic but said that property line disputes were unfortunately common, and suggested I contact a lawyer specializing in real estate law. I took her advice and made an appointment with a lawyer named Sarah Goldstein for the following day. As I waited for my appointment, I kept an eye on Mrs. Henderson's yard. True to her word, on Tuesday morning, a crew showed up and began digging post holes along the line of stakes. I rushed out to talk to them. "Excuse me," I called to the foreman, a burly man in a worn baseball cap. "I'm sorry, but there's a dispute about this property line. Could you hold off on the fence until it's resolved?" The foreman looked uncomfortable. "Look, buddy, I just go where I'm told and build what I'm paid for. You'll have to take it up with the lady who hired us." As if on cue, Mrs. Henderson appeared, a smug smile on her face. "Is there a problem here?" I turned to her, trying to keep my cool. "Mrs. Henderson, please? I have a lawyer's appointment today to discuss this. Can't we wait until we've sorted things out legally before putting up a fence?" She laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Oh, sweetie, you go ahead and talk to your lawyer. This fence is going up today, and there's nothing you can do about it." I stood there, helpless, as the crew resumed their work. Feeling defeated, I headed back inside to get ready for my appointment with Sarah Goldstein. The law office was a small, tidy space in a nearby strip mall. Sarah Goldstein turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s with a reassuring air of competence. I explained my situation, showing her my deed and the documents I'd found online. She listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, Mr. Parker, based on what you've shown me, it seems clear that the land in question is indeed yours. Mrs. Henderson doesn't have a leg to stand on legally." I felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by frustration. "But she's putting up a fence right now. What can we do?" Sarah's expression turned grim. "First things first, we're going to send her a cease and desist letter. That should make her stop construction immediately. If she doesn't comply, we can file for an injunction to legally force her to stop." She pulled out a legal pad and began drafting the letter on the spot. "I'll have this typed up and sent via courier this afternoon. In the meantime, I suggest you document everything. Take photos of the fence construction, write down any interactions you have with Mrs. Henderson, and don't engage in any confrontations." I nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. What if she ignores the letter? Sarah gave me a reassuring smile. "Then we take her to court. Based on the evidence you've provided, it would be an easy win for us. She'd be forced to remove the fence and likely have to pay all legal fees. I left Sarah's office feeling more confident but still worried about what I'd find when I got home. As I pulled into my driveway, my heart sank. The fence crew had made significant progress. A line of freshly planted fence posts ran along the disputed property line, mocking me. Mrs. Henderson was in her yard, supervising the work with a self-satisfied smile. When she saw me, she waved, her expression smug. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of Sarah's advice not to engage. Instead, I took out my phone and began taking pictures, carefully documenting the fence's position and the work being done. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the yard. "Taking some pictures for your scrapbook, dear?" I ignored her, continuing to document everything. Once I was done, I went inside and wrote down a detailed account of everything that had happened so far, including times and dates. Around 4 p.m., a courier arrived with Sarah's cease and desist letter. I watched from my window as Mrs. Henderson signed for it, her expression changing from confusion to anger as she read its contents. Moments later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a fuming Mrs. Henderson, the letter clutched in her hand. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving the paper in my face. I kept my voice calm. "It's a cease and desist letter, Mrs. Henderson. You're building a fence on my property without my permission. This letter legally requires you to stop construction immediately." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is ridiculous. I've told you, this is my land." "The legal documents say otherwise," I replied, struggling to maintain my composure. "Please, just stop the construction. We can sort this out properly without making things worse." Mrs. Henderson glared at me for a long moment, then turned and stomped back to her yard. I watched as she angrily gestured at the fence crew, who quickly packed up their tools and left. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this would be the end of it. Oh, how wrong I was. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of power tools. I rushed to my window to see the fence crew back at work, with Mrs. Henderson supervising once again. Disbelieving, I threw on some clothes and went outside. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, "you received a cease and desist letter yesterday. You can't continue building this fence." She turned to me, her expression defiant. "I don't care about your fancy letter. This is my property, and I'll do what I want with it." I pulled out my phone and called Sarah Goldstein's office. To my relief, she picked up herself. "Sarah, it's Mike Parker. Mrs. Henderson is ignoring the cease and desist. They're still building the fence." I could hear Sarah's frustration through the phone. "All right, Mike, I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, but we're going to file for an emergency injunction. I'll submit the paperwork right away. In the meantime, call the police. Report that she's trespassing and illegally building on your property." After hanging up, I dialed cop, feeling slightly ridiculous but not knowing what else to do. Within about 15 minutes, a police car pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers got out, looking somewhat bemused by the situation. I quickly explained what was happening, showing them my deed and the cease and desist letter. The older of the 2 officers, his name tag reading Anderson, nodded and approached Mrs. Henderson. "Ma'am, we've received a complaint about illegal construction. Can you explain what's going on here?" Mrs. Henderson launched into her version of events, insisting that the land was hers and that I was trying to steal it from her. Officer Anderson listened patiently, then turned to me. "Sir, do you have documentation proving your ownership of this land?" I nodded, handing over copies of my deed and the original survey I'd found. Officer Anderson studied them for a moment, then turned back to Mrs. Henderson. "Ma'am, based on these documents, it appears that this land does belong to Mr. Parker. You've also been served with a cease and desist letter, which you're ignoring. I'm going to have to ask you to stop construction immediately." Mrs. Henderson's face contorted with rage. "This is outrageous. I've lived here for 25 years. You can't just come here and side with him over me." Officer Anderson remained calm. "Ma'am, we're not taking sides. We're simply enforcing the law based on the legal documents presented. If you continue construction, you could be charged with criminal trespass and vandalism." For a moment, I thought Mrs. Henderson might actually explode. But then, abruptly, all the fight seemed to go out of her. Her shoulders sagged, and she waved dismissively at the fence crew. Fine. Pack it up, boys. We're done for now." As the crew began to pack up their tools, Officer Anderson turned to me. "Sir, I suggest you follow up with your lawyer to resolve this situation permanently. We can't keep coming out here every time she decides to start building again." I nodded, thanking the officers for their help. As they drove away, I caught Mrs. Henderson glaring at me from her porch. Something told me this was far from over. Over the next few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting Mrs. Henderson to try something, but she seemed to be laying low. I used the time to meet with Sarah again, going over our strategy for the upcoming court hearing. "Based on the documentation we have," Sarah explained, spreading papers across her desk, "this should be a straightforward case. We'll present the original survey, your deed, and evidence of Mrs. Henderson's actions. The judge will almost certainly rule in our favor." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. "What happens then?" Sarah leaned back in her chair. Best case scenario? The judge orders Mrs. Henderson to remove any part of the fence on your property at her own expense. She'll also likely be required to pay our legal fees. Worst case, you might have to pay to have the fence removed, but you'd be able to sue her for those costs. As we wrapped up our meeting, Sarah gave me a reassuring smile. Try not to worry too much, Mike. The law is on our side here. I left her office feeling more confident, but that feeling was short-lived. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Mrs. Henderson in her yard, talking to a man I didn't recognize. They both turned to look at me as I got out of my car, and something about their expressions made my stomach churn. The next morning, I woke up to find a large, official-looking document taped to my front door. My heart sank as I read it. Mrs. Henderson was suing me for adverse possession. I immediately called Sarah, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. Calm down, Mike, Sarah said, her voice steady. This isn't as bad as it seems. Adverse possession claims are very difficult to prove, especially in a case like this. She explained that for an adverse possession claim to be valid, Mrs. Henderson would have to prove that she had been using the disputed land openly, continuously, and exclusively for a statutorily defined period, which in our state was 20 years. From what you've told me, Sarah continued, there's no evidence she's been using that part of your yard at all, let alone for 20 years. This is likely just a scare tactic. Despite Sarah's reassurances, I spent the next few weeks in a state of constant anxiety. Every time I saw Mrs. Henderson in her yard, she would give me a smug look that made my blood boil. I started avoiding my own backyard, not wanting to deal with the stress of seeing her or that partially built fence. Finally, the day of our court hearing arrived. I put on my best suit, feeling like I was preparing for battle. Sarah met me outside the courthouse, looking confident in a sharp navy blazer. Remember, she said as we walked in, let me do the talking. Just stay calm and answer any questions honestly if you're called upon. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with worn wooden benches and a slight musty smell. Mrs. Henderson was already there with her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. She glared at me as we took our seats, but I forced myself to look straight ahead. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, called the court to order. Mrs. Henderson's lawyer went first, spinning a tale about how his client had been using and maintaining the disputed land for decades, how it had always been understood to be part of her property. I found myself gripping the edge of my seat, fighting the urge to jump up and shout that it was all lies. Sarah placed a calming hand on my arm, giving me a reassuring nod. When it was our turn, Sarah calmly and methodically presented our evidence. She showed the original survey, my deed, and photos of the fence construction. She also presented statements from other neighbors confirming that Mrs. Henderson had never used or maintained the land in question. Your Honor, Sarah concluded, the evidence clearly shows that this land legally belongs to my client. Mrs. Henderson's adverse possession claim has no merit, as she cannot prove continuous use for the required 20-year period. We ask that you order the removal of the partially constructed fence and require Mrs. Henderson to pay all associated legal fees. The judge listened intently, occasionally asking questions of both lawyers. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and addressed the court. Having reviewed all the evidence presented, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Parker. The land in question is legally his property, as clearly shown by the deed and original survey. Mrs. Henderson's adverse possession claim is without merit and is hereby dismissed. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The judge continued, Mrs. Henderson is ordered to remove any portion of the fence on Mr. Parker's property within 30 days, at her own expense. She is also ordered to pay Mr. Parker's legal fees in full. Mrs. Henderson let out an indignant gasp, but the judge silenced her with a stern look. Mrs. Henderson, I strongly advise you to comply with this ruling. Any further attempts to encroach on Mr. Parker's property may result in more severe legal consequences. This court is adjourned. As we left the courthouse, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Sarah smiled at me. Congratulations, Mike. Justice prevailed. I thanked her profusely, still somewhat in disbelief that it was really over. As we parted ways, I noticed Mrs. Henderson and her lawyer having a heated discussion by their car. She caught my eye, and for a moment, I thought she might come over to confront me. Instead, she got into her car and drove away, tires screeching against the pavement. I returned home, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Part of me worried that Mrs. Henderson might try something else, but I tried to push those thoughts aside and focus on the victory we'd just achieved. Over the next few days, I kept a watchful eye on Mrs. Henderson's property, but there was no sign of activity. The partially built fence remained untouched, a silent reminder of our conflict. As the days turned into a week, I began to wonder if she was planning to ignore the court order. On the 8th day after the hearing, I woke up to the sound of machinery. Peering out my window, I saw a small crew dismantling the fence posts on my side of the property line. Mrs. Henderson was nowhere to be seen, but I noticed her curtains twitching occasionally, suggesting she was watching from inside her house. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I watched the crew work. They efficiently removed the posts and filled in the holes, leaving no trace of the fence that had caused so much trouble. By lunchtime, they were done, and my property was restored to its original state. As the crew packed up their tools, I ventured outside to inspect their work. The foreman, a different one from the original fence construction, approached me with a clipboard. "Mr. Parker?" he asked, and I nodded. "I need you to sign here, confirming that we've completed the fence removal to your satisfaction." I carefully read over the document before signing. It was a simple statement acknowledging that the fence had been removed in compliance with the court order. As I handed back the clipboard, curiosity got the better of me. "So, did Mrs. Henderson hire you directly?" I asked. The foreman shook his head. "Nah, we were contracted through her lawyer's office. Guess they wanted to make sure it got done within the court's deadline." I nodded, thanking him for the information. As the crew drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The physical reminder of the dispute was gone, and it seemed that Mrs. Henderson had finally accepted defeat. Or so I thought. The next morning, I found an envelope stuffed in my mailbox. Inside was a check from Mrs. Henderson's lawyer's office, covering my legal fees as ordered by the court. But along with the check was a handwritten note from Mrs. Henderson herself. My heart raced as I unfolded it, wondering what new drama this might bring. The note was brief and to the point. "Mr. Parker? I hope you're satisfied with yourself. You may have won this battle, but mark my words, this isn't over. I've lived in this neighborhood for 25 years, and I won't let some newcomer push me around. Watch your back. Mrs. Henderson?" I stood there, staring at the note, a mixture of anger and disbelief washing over me. Part of me wanted to march over to her house and confront her, to tell her to grow up and accept that she was wrong, but I knew that would only escalate things further. Instead, I took a deep breath, folded the note, and went inside to call Sarah. I explained about the note, reading it to her word for word. Sarah sighed heavily. "Well, it's not explicitly a threat, so there's not much we can do legally, but it's definitely concerning. I'd advise you to keep the note and document any further interactions with Mrs. Henderson. If she does anything else, we may be able to file for a restraining order." I thanked Sarah for her advice and hung up, feeling frustrated. I had hoped that the court ruling would be the end of this, but it seemed Mrs. Henderson wasn't ready to let go. Over the next few weeks, life settled into an uneasy routine. I went about my business, trying to enjoy my new home, but always with one eye on Mrs. Henderson's property. She seemed to be going out of her way to make her presence known, spending hours in her front yard gardening or sitting on her porch, always watching me when I came and went. I started feeling paranoid, constantly wondering what she might be planning. Would she try to damage my property when I wasn't home? Would she file some other bogus legal claim? The stress was starting to affect my sleep and my work. About a month after the fence removal, I decided I needed to take action to reclaim my peace of mind. I researched local landscaping companies and found one with good reviews that specialized in privacy hedges. I arranged for them to come out and give me a quote for planting a line of fast-growing evergreens along the property line with Mrs. Henderson. The day the landscaper came to assess the job, Mrs. Henderson was, predictably, in her front yard. I could feel her eyes on us as the landscaper and I walked the property line, discussing options for creating a natural barrier. As we finished up and the landscaper headed back to his truck to write up a quote, Mrs. Henderson approached, a fake smile plastered on her face. "Planning some changes to your yard, Mr. Parker?" she asked, her voice sickly sweet. I nodded, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Just looking into some privacy plantings. Nothing major." Her smile tightened. "I hope you're planning to keep those plants on your side of the property line. We wouldn't want any more misunderstandings, would we?" I felt my temper flare but managed to keep my cool. "Don't worry, Mrs. Henderson. I know exactly where my property line is. Have a nice day." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. As I reached my front door, I heard her call out, "Just remember, Mr. Parker, I'm watching you." I closed the door behind me, leaning against it and taking deep breaths. This woman was really starting to get to me. I knew I needed to do something to protect myself, both legally and for my own peace of mind. The next day, I called Sarah again and explained the situation. I told her about Mrs. Henderson's continued hostile behavior and asked if there was anything else we could do. Sarah thought for a moment before responding. "Given her continued harassment, we might have grounds for a restraining order. It's not a guarantee, but we could petition the court. At the very least, it would send a strong message that her behavior won't be tolerated." I agreed, and Sarah started the process of filing for a restraining order. In the meantime, I went ahead with my plans for the privacy hedge. The landscaping company came out the following week and planted a row of Leyland cypress trees along the property line. They were already about 6 feet tall and would grow quickly, soon providing a solid green wall between our properties. As the trees were being planted, Mrs. Henderson stood at her window watching the entire process. I could almost feel the anger radiating from her, but she didn't come outside or try to interfere. A few days after the trees were planted, I received notice that our petition for a restraining order had been filed, and a court date was set for the following month. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. While I was glad something was being done, I also worried about how Mrs. Henderson would react to being served with the papers. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The day after she was served, I came home from work to find all of my newly planted trees brown and withered. At first, I thought maybe there had been some problem with the planting, but as I got closer, I could smell a strong chemical odor. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. Mrs. Henderson had poisoned my trees. Furious, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting the damage. Then I called the police to report the vandalism. While I waited for them to arrive, I noticed movement in Mrs. Henderson's window. She was watching me, and even from a distance, I could see the smug smile on her face. When the police arrived, I showed them the damaged trees and explained the ongoing situation with Mrs. Henderson. They took my statement and photographs, but warned me that without direct evidence of Mrs. Henderson's involvement, there wasn't much they could do. Frustrated but determined, I called Sarah and updated her on the situation. She was appalled but not entirely surprised. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that will strengthen our case for a restraining order," she said. "I'll add this incident to our petition. In the meantime, I'd strongly recommend installing security cameras around your property. If she tries anything else, we'll have concrete evidence." I took Sarah's advice and had a security system installed the very next day, with cameras covering every angle of my property. I also replaced the poisoned trees, this time opting for more mature plants that were already close to full grown. It was expensive, but worth it for the immediate privacy and peace of mind. As the date of our restraining order hearing approached, things remained tense but quiet. Mrs. Henderson seemed to have realized that she was under surveillance and kept her distance, though I often caught her watching me from her windows. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Sarah and I presented our case, detailing Mrs. Henderson's pattern of harassment, from the initial fence dispute to her ominous note and the tree poisoning incident. We also submitted statements from a few neighbors who had witnessed Mrs. Henderson's erratic behavior towards me. Mrs. Henderson and her lawyer tried to paint her actions as those of a concerned longtime resident simply trying to protect her property. They argued that I was the one harassing her by planting trees to block her view and filing frivolous legal actions. The judge listened to both sides carefully before making his decision. To my immense relief, he granted the restraining order. Mrs. Henderson was ordered to stay at least 100 feet away from me and my property, except when she was in her own home. She was also prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly, including through notes or messages left on my property. As we left the courthouse, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Mrs. Henderson brushed past us, her face a mask of barely contained rage. Her lawyer was trying to calm her down, but she shrugged him off and stormed away. Sarah turned to me with a smile. "Congratulations, Mike. This should put an end to her harassment. If she violates the order in any way, she'll be facing serious legal consequences." I thanked Sarah profusely for all her help. As I drove home, I felt a sense of hope that I might finally be able to enjoy my new home in peace. Over the next few months, life slowly returned to normal. Mrs. Henderson kept to herself, and while I occasionally saw her watching me from her windows, she made no attempt to approach or contact me. My new trees grew taller and fuller, creating a lush green barrier between our properties. As spring turned to summer, I finally felt comfortable enough to start working on the vegetable garden I had originally planned. I spent weekends tilling the soil, building raised beds, and planting a variety of vegetables. It was therapeutic, helping me put the stress and drama of the past months behind me. One Saturday afternoon, as I was watering my newly planted tomatoes, I heard a voice call out from the other side of my hedge. "Mr. Parker, are you there?" I froze, recognizing Mrs. Henderson's voice. For a moment, I considered ignoring her, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the hedge, staying on my side of the property line. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson?" I called back, my voice cautious. There was a pause, and then she spoke again, her voice lacking its usual edge. I wanted to apologize. For everything? I've had a lot of time to think, and I realize now that I was wrong. The land was yours, and I behaved terribly. I stood there, stunned into silence. This was the last thing I had expected. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice wavering slightly. "I've lived here for so long, I guess I just couldn't handle the idea of things changing. But that's no excuse for how I treated you. I'm truly sorry." I took a deep breath, trying to process this sudden turn of events. Part of me wanted to hold on to my anger, to reject her apology after all the stress she had caused. But another part of me recognized the courage it must have taken for her to come and say this. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Henderson," I said finally. "It means a lot to hear you say that." "I know it doesn't make up for everything," she replied, "but I hope maybe we can start fresh. Be neighbors, in the true sense of the word." I thought for a moment before responding. "I'd like that, Mrs. Henderson. It'll take some time to rebuild trust, but I'm willing to try if you are." "Thank you, Mr. Parker. And please, call me Linda." "All right, Linda. I'm Mike." We chatted for a few more minutes, somewhat awkwardly at first, but gradually becoming more comfortable. As we said goodbye, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. It would take time, but maybe we could move past this and become, if not friends, at least cordial neighbors. Over the following weeks and months, Linda and I slowly built a tentative friendship. She respected the restraining order, keeping her distance, but we would often chat over the hedge. She gave me gardening tips, and I helped her set up her new smartphone. As summer turned to fall, I invited Linda over for a backyard barbecue, along with a few other neighbors. It was a pleasant afternoon, filled with good food and conversation. As the sun began to set, Linda pulled me aside. "Mike," she said, her eyes misty, "I want to thank you for giving me a second chance. I know I didn't deserve it after how I behaved." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Linda. I'm just glad we were able to move past our rough start." She nodded, then gestured to the thriving vegetable garden behind us. "Your garden turned out beautifully, much nicer than any fence could have been." We both laughed, the sound of our shared mirth drifting across the yard where our properties met, no longer divided by fences or feuds, but united in neighborly harmony. As I looked around at my home, my flourishing garden, and my newfound friends, I realized that sometimes, the most difficult beginnings can lead to the most rewarding outcomes. What had started as a property dispute had transformed into a valuable life lesson about patience, forgiveness, and the true meaning of being a good neighbor. The fence that never was had ultimately built a stronger community than I could have ever imagined. And as I raised my glass in a toast to new friendships and fresh starts, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought us all to this moment. Are you hungry for more slices of stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to never miss out on any videos. See you tomorrow at Story Slices.